It's great to be with you, Dr. Brown. Have you been having a busy week?
We have. COVID has become a very real problem, even in our small rural communities now, and that's keeping us very busy. Our hospital has stayed consistently over about 75 total patients. Some of the bigger hospitals are over 100, and our ICU is pretty well full. As of right now, I got 20 patients on vents,
Hmm.
which is a lot of patients for us. I guess as a 400 bed hospital, about a quarter of us is taken up with COVID right now. But I hear that the local hospitals are all doing the same. I hear our friends over in the St. Louis area are suffering even more. So it's a lot going on.
When I can vouch for Kirksville's been pretty much out of it, and yet we now have a completely full hospital and have been told that if you're sick, go to Illinois.
Yeah.
And so it is, the school systems have shut down, which they haven't to date. There's always been a partial attendance, and right now we're just sweating it out here, even up in northern Missouri, where we pretty much have escaped up until, like I said, the last week or two. It's gotten pretty crazy here. So I think if we're this bad, I'm sure everybody throughout Missouri is suffering right now equally, because we're about the last the last refuge, I think, isolated up here in Kirksville. So,
Well, I think I'll get us started. We kind of
so
went
this,
through our disclaimer slides there. I'd like to welcome everybody to this wonderful program we have tonight with Jason Haxton, our director of the A.T. Steel Museum in Kirksville, Missouri. It's always a pleasure to have him with us. This event brought to you with MAOPS. I'm Dr. Michael Brown, president of MAOPS, and I'm very grateful that we are able to meet with you. We're very grateful for Jason and his help during this series. We've had multiple discussions about osteopathic history, and we've been able to learn a lot about A.T. Still and our osteopathic roots. So tonight's topic is going to be an osteopathic approach to mental health and discussing the history of mental health within the osteopathic profession. And so I'd like to start off this conversation. I guess I should say this to everybody who's listening live with us. If you have a question, please type it into the chat below. I will try to incorporate it as we go along, and if not, we'll address them all at the end. But if you'll just type it into the chat, we will add any questions that you have to this program. This is interactive, so feel free to throw in anything that you feel inspired to do so. That way I don't have to make up all the questions, and I'd love to hear from you and from your questions as well. And so to set the stage, Jason, I was hoping that we could first talk about mental health as an overall condition in the late 1800s. So this would be the time when A.T. Still formed our profession, formed the first school. What was mental health like back then, or the practice of medicine, and if you had a mental health disorder, was there treatment at that time, or what happened? What would it have been like?
well, and it's hard for when we look at such great care, and this is what I love about our program together, Dr. Brown, is that you get to look at the past, but you give us a good firm footing in what's happening now. And so it's probably hard to imagine a time when somebody with mental illness being put in prison or what they call an alms building, basically a building for the poor. Basically, you're literally removed from society, or it's your family's problem. There was no social services, to mandate taking care. If you had a child or a family member that was mentally ill, that was your that was your basically problem, and you're going to have to work with it. And so, really, up through most of Dr. Still's life, that was standard treatment. Was that there wasn't really a place, or if there was a place, it was so horrible you were really just being put away to die. And we're going to talk about one of the asylums in Cook County, Illinois, called the Dunning, the Dunning Asylum. And the funny thing is, its name wasn't Dunning. It was just the asylum, and the train station was the Dunning station. So they just basically called it the Dunning Asylum, and that name is stuck through perpetuity. And to this day, it never really had a name.
Now, I'm of the understanding that there were some treatments at the time, or at least some basic philosophies of mental health treatment that actually came out of Europe. And I believe even one of our founding fathers, or I believe Constitution signers, was somebody who helped push this. Can you tell us a little bit more about that philosophy and that treatment philosophy that was going on?
You're alluding to Benjamin Rush, who really did, give us a lot of our medical ideas, at least put us on some path. I mean, from really just out in the wilderness and figure it out to at least some structure. Now, heroic medicine, blister bleeding and poisoning, which was what Rush brought us, it didn't always help, but at least it was something. And so in Europe, they were looking really at the community environment, and in the 1700s, which means by 1800s, it flipped over to where we were at, and so we started looking at more of a communal and a community cause of illness. And there was also the attitude, I mean, as we moved forward in time, there were body issues that could be causing mental illness, and there were social or community issues that could be causing. And those community issues, I mean, could be family, loss, death, illness, things that, poverty, things today that still affect one's mental well-being, their social economic system and the community that they're within. Lack of opportunity or education could cause some people to withdraw and go into mental illness. So it was Rush who at least started us looking at maybe if we treated these people more as a community with care, we might be doing more help. And Dr. Still bought into that idea.
You know, it's very interesting when you study how these people first approach mental health disorders, because it does sound very holistic, at least at this point, where they believe that the setting or the environment is what led to these medical conditions. Now, we obviously know with, current theories and current medical knowledge that there are many cases, if not most cases now, have an underlying genetic component and also a chemical component. But we still do believe that even those genetic components are altered by the situation, which it seems like this is what they were trying to do, was trying to get people out of certain social situations, put them in another place for treatment and see if that would bring about the cure, which to me sounds an awful lot like, A.T. Still's philosophies with the human body, which is that if we get the body into the right proper structure, then it will heal itself.
Right. And again, we're talking about, are we looking at something acute, that something just kind of happened, versus chronic, which is a long-term condition, and how you treat those differently. And Dr. Still would be of the mind, at least initially, acute means something was normal and it shifted. Meaning that it went to abnormal. Can we normally bring it back, just as I'm out and my body's feeling great and I'm swinging the axe and all of a sudden, I pulled a rib out of place. That's sudden and can usually very quickly be put back. Or, as you say, my life is going good, and out of expecting, I have a loss of a child, a spouse, a close family member, and suddenly that suddenness throws things out of whack on more of a temporary basis. The belief is we could get that person back to where they need to be. And so Dr. Still had a very caring, loving manner about him. And as he said, the body can be out of adjustment just as you can twist or turn or stretch something. So can the mental acuity. The mind itself can be twisted or stretched or pushed beyond its limits, and it'll need some healing to come back. But the goal is to bring it back. And isolationism, there are a lot of things that we look at today, and the COVID virus, mental health is really a much bigger issue in the last 8 to 9 months, for the nation in general. I look at it because, of course, my wife works with the students, and we're thinking these are probably the healthiest students that are really focused on medicine, and yet the challenges they're feeling under the pressure and changing of education, and not knowing how to navigate. There isn't a logical path, and so that uncertainty causes more stress in already a stressful environment. And so what we're finding is our counselors in general don't have enough time to see all the need. And they're normal people with normal problems. I mean, that's basic counseling. We're not talking about, severe issues, but they need to be addressed and worked with. And Dr. Still had a natural um, love and caring for people. And I'm going to pull up a slide because I want us to kind of briefly look at Dr. Still's kind of way of looking at. Uh, There we go. I always have to bring this up to the full slide. But we look at the body, and this was in alignment with what you were talking about, Dr. Brown, that the European ideals that Benjamin Rush kind of brought into the United States was that there was the thought that there could be physical issues causing mental health, but then there could be also stressors that work on the mind, and that we need to be aware of those and how to, you know, be more caring with these people that are struggling. So Dr. Still made it very clear in his definition of osteopathy that it is a biological, very physical, very chemistry related, very what we can see as body. But then he pushes it, says, but osteopathy is psychology. It's our spirit, our mental capacity, who we are uniquely inside this body. And he had an amazing ability to understand people. He observed, I mean, why he came up with these ideas of health and diet and exercise and even what manipulations could help bodies, it was because of observation. And so he could also observe the mental health of a person. Dr. Still would say, if something doesn't fit, then it needs to be addressed. But when things are fine, when there's a homeostasis and an equilibrium, there's no need to do anything. But you should be aware and moving people when things aren't fitting. And so this cause and effect helped him understand the whole person need, not just the physical body, which medicine was really focused on the body mostly. And Dr. Still says, no, there's a lot more. And as a matter of fact, the more important component is actually this mind spirit aspect. And with Dr. Still, he's described by many people, particularly Ernest Tucker, who was a patient, a student, and then later a faculty member. He said it was soul to soul, that it was instantaneous. Dr. Still's love for a person, you felt it. It was there. It wasn't the niceties of the weather and what you're wearing. It was really person to person connecting. And that's what made his treatment so much better. And our osteopaths, past physicians, are seen as having a better patient rapport through their training. The manipulative medicine not only teaches us to understand when a body is in a normal adjustment, but it also encourages us to connect physically. That just touch on the shoulder changes everything in a person when there is this connection, and there is not this fear of connecting with the patient by a touch, by soothing the patient, by intent, stare, and look at you as a person. So again, we feel that Dr. Still passed this on as kind of what we should understand. And then Dr. Still said, the body is important, but what's more difficult is this spiritual aspect. And that's what I wanted to work on at the end of my life, which brings us into the mental health aspects of the Still Hildreth Sanitarium. We'll talk about that. But Dr. Still made it very clear, before you even touch your patient, before you touch that physical body, maybe you do see something out of whack. Before you even touch the patient, you must comprehend that there is this mind, this spirit inside, and that needs to be connected with first to gain that trust to then work with the body. So I think it's fascinating when we think of Dr. Still. Um, and so here's this definition I told you about, his handwritten definition signed off. But again, it is more than physical. There is this mental aspect of psychology that we need to be aware of in treating patients. Um, and so stop that for a minute.
Well, and it's interesting, you talk about that importance of touch and touching the human soul, even with that physical connection. And as a graduate from his university, I remember the current dean, Dr. Wilson at the time, taught our physical exams class, and we were taught to touch the patient, to have that bond, a hand on the shoulder, a hand on the knee, touch the patient, do a physical exam, almost even if they don't need that physical exam, simply because it makes that human connection. And when we talk about things with COVID, this has been a very difficult struggle for me. And I bet some of the physicians on this call could relate to that as well, the psychology behind it. I've had to not touch my patients. I've had to not shake their hands. I've lost that. And I will tell you, I feel that difference in the patient room. I feel that difference in treating my patients, not having that physical connection that then creates that emotional connection between us. It's almost as if a part of my training has been put on hold because of that, because of COVID, just like many other things have done.
Right? It's like being handicapped. I will never forget, and I'm not sick very often. I'm a very healthy person, but I went in to see a physician, and this physician obviously didn't go to our school. And I remember, I think I might have had bronchitis or something. I mean, I had some kind of chest, something nasty virus or whatever. And I just remember he was talking to me, and he had a pen, and he kept tapping me in the chest, and he would be telling me things, and he kept touching me with this pen. And I kept feeling like he doesn't want to touch me. I'm a disease. And, and anything he said, I never even heard him because his pen just kept coming and hitting me. And then he would say something, and then he'd hit me with the pen, and then he'd hit me again with the pen. If he had just touched me on the shoulder, I might have listened to him. But to this day, it's been 20 years. All I remember is I felt like a disease. And granted, I wasn't really doing very well at the time, but I didn't need to be poked with an object that had nothing to do with medicine. I mean, even if it had been a needle, I would have thought I'm getting treated.
Well,
So,
going back to our discussion about earlier treatments of mental health disease, and that whole philosophy of moral treatment and trying to get patients out of the situation that's causing the disease, that kind of set Kirksville up as an ideal situation for treating mental health because they placed these sanitariums, these mental health hospitals in rural settings. Can you talk to us more about that and maybe lead into the first sanitarium and mental health treatment that occurred there in Kirksville with AT Still?
I'm glad you brought that up because, yes, actually, this putting these asylums or sanitariums out in the countries had twofold. One, to the embarrassment. People felt that, well, if mental illness is in my family, my child, then people are going to look at me that I'm next. And so you didn't want that near, sadly, you wanted to remove that away from you. But then there was the philosophy also that these countryside, these rural areas, and you can't get more rural than Kirksville, these rolling hills with ponds and fresh food and, nature. And you weren't in the crowded pressures of city and no, movement and populations. So partly was removing them into a natural setting. And this is what Dr. Still said. We need to commune with nature every single day. And so I'm our listeners, I want you to realize, even as tough as it is right now, get out, get that daily walk. Dr. Still says it's good for you to breathe the fresh air. It's good for you to exercise. You might pick up a little gossip that might be beneficial. Find out the news, what's happening. Get out, but you must also experience nature because we come from nature, and to it is has a healing effect on the soul. And so by placing these places in these more rural areas, Kirksville was ideal for the kind of a sanitarium that we developed, and it became a footprint. It was really kind of a newer idea, but because of its success, every osteopathic sanitarium, whether it's the Waldo in Seattle, which only closed recently, they all followed the same, just as all the osteopathic schools followed the original that had a lot of success, and therefore it ensured success. This sanitarium became the role model and was hugely successful. And want to again pull up some images and get some of your thoughts. we might again go back before we go to the beautiful one we were just. Let's just briefly go back to what was called the Dunning Insane Asylum. Can you see that?
You're not sharing yet, not yet.
Okay. This is one of those things where let me. I got to get really tricky with this. Share the screen, and there we go. And now we're going to share. And yeah, there it is. Okay. And moving back to this. Okay, are we all good there?
There we go.
Worth more dead than alive. That's the sad thing about these asylums. As we look at the massiveness, the Dunning Asylum, which was in Cooks County, that basically Chicago, Illinois, um, it was basically as being basically a living tomb, is how it was described. And once you were placed there, you were forgotten. And the deaths, I mean, you were a non-entity. The funny thing is, when they actually excavated the grounds, they found almost 38,000 bodies buried in the backyard, so to speak. And so with these deaths, it became a very easy place for medical schools to go to these places and get their cadavers. I mean, one of the warnings was, if you don't behave, you're going to end up at Dunning. That was a very legitimate threat to kids back in the day. But it also was, if you end up in poverty, if you end up in prison, if you become a no good, the threat was you'll become a cadaver on a slab and a medical student will be picking through you. And that was just the worst thing you could imagine at that time. And now, of course, people so freely donate their bodies because they see the positive aspect of that. And so in the Dunning, we actually needed bodies at Kirksville. And so William Smith, our European anatomist and scholar, went to Chicago to get these bodies because people died. I mean, look how massive this institution is. And while he was there, they were going past, various what they would just considered freaks. A lot of, as you mentioned, sometimes the genetic issues that we understand today that may have an influence on one's mental health weren't understand there. And so as they're going by these different cases, the caretaker basically looks over and says, do you see anything you want? And of course, William Smith, being an osteopath now and a humanitarian, says, whoa, these are living people. Uh, he goes, I've come for cadavers. And it's like, well, this is the killer ward. And, they're going to be killed very soon. And so, just letting you know, if you saw something, a person with an extra digit or maybe the dog-faced boy, I mean, this is where you went if you didn't fit in society, is you were cast into these asylums. So do you see any freaks that you want? Because, it'd probably make a good lesson at your medical school. And Smith was appalled. And later, what ended up happening is this was discovered as a horrible institution. What happened was one of the bodies that we were given was a young woman, and she came from a prominent family. And when she was dead and there was no body, the wealthy family made a stink, and they discovered what was happening, that all these cadavers, and some of them being murdered, these people were being shipped off to all these medical schools. And we came back to Missouri, we couldn't get bodies. And when our governor, Lon Stevens, who used osteopathy and actually enacted the bills legalizing physicians in 1897, Lon said, what's the problem here? They're trying to extradite our faculty back to Chicago to prison. And first of all, he says, no, we're not sending Smith back to Chicago. You've got your own mess there. But he goes, what's the problem? It's like, we can't get cadavers. And Governor Stevens said, that will never be a problem. You will get a fair share with all the other. We have ample institutions here, and you will get your fair share of cadavers. And we never needed to do that again. So, it is interesting how horrible it was to be in one of these institutions. I don't know. You have anything to add, Dr. Brown?
It actually brings me back memories. When I was in community, I did my last few years of high school. We did a joint where you could go to community college classes as well as high school. And so one of my classes I took was psychiatry. It was a high school college level class, and you got extra credit if you'd go up to St. Joseph and go tour the Glore Psychiatric Museum. I don't know if you're familiar with that or anybody listening to that. But I would encourage individuals, if you'd like to go to that museum in St. Joseph, Missouri. But I remember as a young man having some pretty icky feelings of going through that museum and the treatments that they would do to individuals and how they would treat them. And this story just brings back memories of that. We had a very poor understanding of mental health at that time,
Right.
which is kind of why we were having this conversation about how AT still started changing that. He developed this sanitarium, which I know we're going to get into, and I don't know if now would be a good time to talk about how he changed the treatment going from this model that you just described here to the one that was in Kirksville.
And we go back to Dr. Still, as he calls his religion, love everybody and be fair to people. And so, of course, you look at this picture of Dr. Still with the kids and friends and family and, the power of love. And that was one of his favorite little quotes was, I love to be loved. And I love to love people and I love to be loved. Don't you? I mean, what's wrong with you if you don't love being loved? And yet that is the compassion that when people are struggling to still have them feel that love and again this is as a patient you don't want to feel like an object. You want to feel that you have importance and that your life means something and that you're loved. And Dr. Still certainly you know brought this out. And of course, we were teaching at the school very early on psychology and physiology, so mind and body were part of the coursework. This is in 1890. I'm trying to remember 98. They were already basically I know John Martin Littlejohn from England was one of our first people to talk about the body mind connection and need for health that and how we work with that, which obviously led to what we think of as the Still Hildreth Sanitarium. This certainly doesn't look as scary. I mean, if we go back to the Dunning, oh my gosh, this looks like something. There's a reason why all the paranormal investigations are held in these kinds of places. Horrible treatments of electric shots and lobotomies and death. 38,000 people. I mean, certainly there's something wrong going on there. And then you look at this colorful lakes, trees. The ceiling was all glass. It was, I mean, this was created with so that natural light poured through the building all the way down to the basement. I mean, there was no structure like this in the United States. It was so inviting and healthy. So, again, the environment makes a lot of difference about how you're going to heal. Um, the funny thing is, all of the psychiatrists that were DOs and doctors here, I mean, they were doctors. So there was no stigma. If you had measles or had some issue, strep throat, or you would go to the sanitarium to be treated because they were doctors. We have the patient records and we see just as many people being treated for flat foot as dementia or incontinence or something like that.
Now, I know that A.T. Still himself actually had his own history with mental illness, and I think that kind of played into him helping create this sanitarium and move forward with it. Can you tell us a bit about how that happened and maybe even some examples in his own life with patient cases that also influenced him?
This is why you're one of our outstanding students at the school, because you understood that, yeah, this didn't all, nothing happens in a vacuum. You have to have some experience in order to relate. And so Dr. Still not only had lost his first wife, I mean, and who he truly loved, but then in succession lost four more children. So, I mean, his entire family was wiped out by disease. That has to have some bearings on, and that's really what drove him to look for better health care, because nobody should lose their wife and their children. And then his new wife lost two more children. So what I'm saying is there was a bond between his wife, who is basically a pharmacist and grew up in a medical family. His second wife, she could empathize with her own loss and then his loss. She loved these children too, like they were her own. And so they kind of understood the depression and how hard things could be. And so in his own life, then, as he got started his new family, his youngest son, Fred, was crushed while messing around with some of the farm horses. These big horses pushed him against the side of the barn and crushed him. And he lingered for months before dying. And so Dr. Still was really pained by losing the child that he thought was going to do the most for osteopathy. And then that very wife that had struggled with him through all of these things, Mary Elvira, she herself, I mean, died in 1910, 7 years before Dr. Still. And after she died, all of his research, experiments, book writing, you don't see really much more after 1910. He truly was broken by the loss of his wife. He had no ambition to do something new. He was just going to spend his time from 1910 pretty much to his death until one of the closest friends, the dean, Arthur Hildreth, who he had raised as a child himself with his own children, his wife died fairly young. And Hildreth was like, it's over. This was in 1913. She died of cancer and struggled for months. And Hildreth was like, my life is over. And AT still says, I can relate. When Mary Elvira died, 3 years ago, I thought my life was over, but it isn't. And you're way too young to be giving up right now. If you were around people that suffered the same depression you did, you would actually, in treating them, get better. And so I have an idea. I've always wanted to build this sanitarium where we deal with mental illness and we treat people with diet, exercise, socializing, work, hobbies, music, these things that will help them recover. And so Hildreth goes for it, and that's why it's the Still Hildreth. And guess what? He remarries, he ends up himself becoming healthier. And so this whole institution was built for one man, but it helped tens of thousands. I feel like I'm in a Star Trek episode. The needs of one outweigh the many. And then in the end, the needs of the many can help the one. So if you're a Star Trek fan, I think we're all old enough. But what we do see is the whole idea really came from the need of a close friend of Dr. Still's who was very suffering. And so that's how we ended up with the Still Hildreth. And when we look at it, I mean, so it's a little sideways because this is the brochure, but you can see the grounds were very beautiful. There was, I mean, swimming and beach and fishing and golf. They had their own milk and dairy products. I mean, it was its own self-sustaining food supply. They had greenhouses with every available food year round. Look at the dining. This isn't an asylum. This looks like a vacation. Um, Look at the interior. These were the rooms with this open space, and up on the ceiling, this glass light, natural light coming through 24 hours, well, at least moonlight during the nights. But look at the plants and the seating. This again was not what people thought of when they thought of an institution to treat mental illness. And you can see again the walking paths, the nature connecting to this building. You see the pagoda where you could go and basically in a little gazebo area relax and read and be tranquil with nature. Look at the bedrooms. I mean, they were, again, these were very nice facilities and people got better. It worked.
Now, for those that aren't as familiar with it, can you briefly describe the location? I believe this is in Macon, correct?
Correct. So here's the thing. Dr. Still wanted to start the osteopathic school in Macon, but they basically had gotten bad information in Kansas because the church called him out. I mean, if you touch people with your hands and they get better, you must be Jesus, and we certainly know, Dr. Still, you're no Jesus, so you must be the great pretender. You must be the demon himself. You must be the devil. Well, so he gets run out of Kansas. He comes back to Macon. That's actually where his dad first brought the family, and where he started basically recruiting for the Methodist Church. So Macon was home to the Stills, and his brother was still there practicing medicine. He was a little bit on a bender for opium because that was one of the treatments, for these psychiatric patients. You give them arsenic, cyanide, mercury. I mean, if they survived the treatment, they would have all these health issues. So the bottom line is his brother was kind of addicted to morphine. And so, again, creating these mental issues, AT still kind of dried out his brother, started getting some success in Macon. But sure enough, the church from Kansas contacted the church members in Macon and said, "You've got a problem with this man." And they literally stopped the business and ran him out of town. So Dr. Still goes to the next biggest city, which was Kirksville, but at that time was only about 1,800 people. And the people of Kirksville treated, as he said, they treated me with kindness. They accepted me. If you ever ask Dr. Still, but what about those no-gooders in Kansas and those people of Macon that made your life tough? You know what? A.T. Still said, they didn't understand me. They're not bad people. If they'd understood me, they'd have lifted me on their shoulders and carried me through the streets, but they didn't. And I don't want to think about that. Let me tell you about the people that gave me some free lodging and helped me out and listened to my ideas. See, Dr. Still did not dwell in the negative. And that's a really good thing about mental health. He himself was very mentally healthy. And so what we find is that if you want to wallow in negativity, then that's where you're going to stay mentally. But if you change your thinking and think of the positive, your body actually grows. It's more open to healing. Things are better. And so we know that again, optimism. And Dr. Still stayed in his optimism. If you tried to bring him into the negativity of what went wrong, he would never stand for it. He would always find the silver lining to that cloud and why it wasn't so bad after all. Though he did say, did God have to take my wife and children to push me to create osteopathic healthcare? Did he have to do something that severe? And I guess he did because it did push Dr. Still into where we are today. So again, a wonderful institution, and it was quite successful up through 1966. I think you might be familiar with starting in the mid 60s, 1960s, psychotropic drugs kind of started coming into vogue, that you could treat mental illness with drugs. And there is a place for drugs, but many of the psychiatrists would say the drugs are only meant to be a temporary thing to get you back into control. Again, if you're a normal person with normal problems, the drugs are going to alter you, and that's not going to be a necessarily good thing. We're not talking about severe cases. We're talking about average people. And so the idea was they should be a temporary thing. But what we went is wholeheartedly is it's drugs every day, all the time. And that actually removed all these sanitariums that were working from a whole different attitude. Diet was so important. For instance, some of these patients were photographers. They Photography was new in the 1900s, and to set the photographs, they used cyanide and arsenic were typical chemicals to set these black and white pictures permanently, and you would be dipping your fingers in this stuff. Now, you're supposed to wear rubber gloves, but you get lazy in your business. So here are these photographers making thousands of pictures, dipping their fingers in cyanide and arsenic. It's leaching, and they're going crazy. So now that they're crazy, they send them to the sanitarium. With heavy fat and milk diets, the metal is being gathered out of the brain, out of their system, and these people come back to normal. So these treatments that they were pioneering, no one told them what to do. They were figuring it out, was actually having some huge success. Sometimes a woman may be playing a piano, and as she's playing, she turns her head and something kind of locks and they go catatonic. Dr. Still says, I've worked on the body of someone who was catatonic. They just stared, they didn't respond. The family kept them alive. And 6, 7 years later, I discovered that here's the problem with the nerve and the neck, and I treat it, and they instantly go back and finish off the piano piece that they had started 6 years earlier. So this would be something that would be very physical that stopped the ability versus something very chemical. They were doing everything at the sanitarium, but diets were so important at this place. Now, of course, once the drugs came into the market, all of these places closed down. But what we've realized in the last 15 to 20 years is that drugs are not the answer to every case. And all these things pioneered by Dr. Still, they're going back to and rediscovering and reissuing in mental health. So he was really kind of ahead of the game. The good thing is the records were not lost and they've been basically reissued and reshared. And people are looking at what they were using. It's great success.
Jason, I'm going to take over the screen for just a second because I'd
Yep.
like to show our viewers something that I've pulled up here that I think you'll find interesting.
Cool.
You may be aware of this. This is an article from the American Academy of Osteopathy back in 2014. And I think you had a hand in at least some of the data on this, but this was by a Dr. Leslie Ching. This is about the Still Hilder Sanitarium and Sanatorium. And this is actually a picture. This was taken, about 5 years ago. It still stands. They actually use it for housing of elderly in the community. Some of the color photos of what that looked like, and you can see that here. This is one photo where they, kept the more dangerous patients that were violent to staff or the physicians. But you can still see these beautiful grounds. It wasn't just a painting. You can see that it was surrounded by these beautiful lakes and trees. But what I also thought was interesting is that Dr. Ching here with the records compiled these nice little tables taken from records from the museum that show all the different diagnoses. They had over 1,891 records that they pulled. And these are all the different diagnoses that were treated during that time. And I'm just going to scroll down to the summaries here, but you can pull this up yourself with a quick Google search. But you'll see that,
Oh, yeah.
mainly it was psychosis, schizophrenia, and then some, anxiety disorders and depression, and then bipolar disorder, which is actually very typical of what you would see today requiring a more advanced mental health. We don't institutionalize these individuals anymore, but these are the people that I would refer to a psychiatrist for additional help and assistance, in managing some of these patients. And then, as you mentioned, there were several medical cases that would come there as well that were not psychiatric related. So I just thought our listeners and viewers might like to see some of the actual medical data, and they can pull this up themselves and kind of browse through the different diagnoses that were given during the time that this museum or this sanatorium was open.
Right, and I'm glad you brought that up because actually, Dr. Leslie Ching and I are going to be doing a CME with the AOA, I think in March. She just wrote me, and because we did support her, but I wanted to let you also, and stop right there for a second. When you look at this picture, you see, if you look to the left, there's two buildings, and there's one building that's, kind of small. It looks like almost like a church or a chapel. That is actually where they kept the most severe cases. So they realized that there were truly the dementia, what we would consider the Alzheimer's type patients that had no connection to reality. There were also World War I mustard gas survivors that had gone crazy and they were violent. And so the cells that you showed would be in the basement of that building, and those with the most dementia, yeah, this cell. But here's what they did. Despite the fact that these were very dangerous, very violent people, they would twice a day, outside that door, you would go into a courtyard and they would be basically interacting. It was a fenced area, but they were exposed to nature twice a day and given that opportunity, treated as humanely as they could, in view of how dangerous these patients were. Because they understood that they're still human, and trying to treat them with as much care as possible. And in one of those prison cells, what's interesting is you see all the drawings of Nazis and the war that they'd scratched into the walls. They had left the graffiti that had been there from several of the patients, and you could see how psychological, what we could call post-traumatic stress disorder, that's what some of these patients were suffering from, and they could not readapt into the world. And so the only way to keep them was in these environments, and yet they still tried to treat them humanely. The other thing I wanted to stress is this list of cases is from the time they opened in 1914 till 1924. So this is only 10 years of records. what had happened is when they closed the institution in 1966, all those medical charts came to Kirksville, and they were systematically destroying them, beginning with the newest. They would, like, every so many months, get rid of so many files. And so they got busy and they stopped in 1924 and just kind of left the files. And then one day they came to the museum and said, these seem to be historic because they moved so far back that maybe these belong in the museum. And so we said, yeah. And so we were fortunate because we actually get the records from Dr. Still and the earliest influences, Hildreth, up through 1924, which we consider the most important osteopathically. And so we do have those. Now, they're available, but we, of course, remove names and cities because people can figure stuff out with HIPAA and things like that, that we really want to make sure that they can be used without giving away, because there still is personal stigmas for mental illness and stuff even today. And so look at how many things they treated in just those 10 years. So anyway, I'm glad you showed this because I think this really tells the story.
Thank you, and thanks for your help with putting that together. Just thinking about this, I thought just kind of a quick, fun side topic, and more historical, was during this time, the idea behind mental illness and what caused mental illness was a very variety of approaches. Let me put it this way. This was, I try to put myself back in a mindset back then. So we did not know about DNA. We didn't know about genes and genetics. We didn't know about hormones in the brain. We didn't have SSRIs. And so I guess my question is, what was the common thought back then about why an individual had a mental illness or a mental disease?
Well, the funny thing is that two areas, it would be like too much sex or not enough, so too repressed sex. So it's like, as Dr. Still said, everything in moderation. But the idea, some mental illness, I mean, was always focusing on, repressed sexual tendencies or overt and out of control. And so we actually ended up during the simultaneously with what Dr. Still was doing, there was the Battle Creek, basically sanitarium. And that basically, to some degree, though, it was started by Post and Kellogg. And we think of those people, I mean, cereal, right? They were looking at vegetarian diets and diets as being, again, healthier for people. And so that's kind of why their name stuck to these cereals. But then they also were looking at a lot of what we would consider not good treatments of men and women in their institutions. So that was one area they looked at for causing these illnesses. There was demonic possessions, that it's demons, that religion is what's going to save you. And uh, unfortunately, we find that these days some mental illness comes from religion. I mean, what I'm saying is either being abused or over involvement to some degree, what we consider cult. I mean, all of us could be. What I'm saying is that it goes out of moderation. Dr. Still says we can deal with anything in moderation. Once you leave moderation, diet, if you can eat anything. But if you eat too much, then your body can't get rid of it. And now you're going to start overwhelming the system. And so, as anything, Dr. Still said, oh, I got my vices. It's whiskey, it's chocolate, and it's tobacco. And so I only do one at a time. So I'll go on my whiskey binge for a couple of weeks, and then no more whiskey. Then it's chocolate. And I'll do chocolate for a couple of weeks, and then no more chocolate. Then basically it's my tobacco. And you can see pictures with little bits of tobacco stains in his beard. And then he go back to whiskey. But when we look at, again, a lot of mental illness was based on, something you did that you're being somewhat cursed. And so it is sad because as Dr. Still approached it, he said, again, sometimes, I mean, I guess in our communities here, I'm very close to the Amish. And a lot of us look at them and go, oh my gosh, I mean, wouldn't it be great to be an Amish? I passed about 10 buggies. Thursday night is always a Marion and Berrien day. Thursday, the Amish do not, they basically leave that day open for anything that comes up. And so it's a wedding, or it could be a death, and or socializing, just getting together. But the thing is, we romanticize. Oh my gosh, but it's a hard life. And there's more antidepressant medication. When the Amish came to our community, they wanted to see a doctor, and I thought nothing of. And the first thing that they were getting was Zoloft, and it's like it floored me. It's like, but you're on this pedestal. You're these ideal. And they said, Jason, we're not more religious. We're not. People think this, and we don't get it. We don't understand why you think we're so religious. We only have church every other week at each other's house. You English people have church 2, 3 times a week, and you call us religious? I mean, that's their argument. Is, but what we're looking at is we do think that, oh my gosh, how romantic. No, it's muddy, it's hard. Every day's a struggle, and then you've got kids. You've got 7, 8 kids and a newborn, and sometimes they go into what they call these black kind of depressions, and they can't even function. And some of these cases, imagine, 8, 9 kids was pretty typical. My family, the Chetman, had 13. What I'm saying, imagine these women trying to keep up with the household and the kids. Of course they would go into depression and mental illness issues. And so just having this opportunity to just recoup and get back on a normal stream till you get back to your life. It's amazing by caring for people how much better osteopathic medicine or the sanitariums have been looking at mental health. What we understand just in the last decade on autism. I mean, as far as when we look at on the scale, we now understand it's not that there might be more of it, but maybe we're looking at it more. We're understanding it and have more compassion for those that are, neuroapt, as we call them, versus those that look at the world in a different way. But again, we're looking at heredity and children of these people, the chances, and how can we treat and work with these people. So again, we become what Dr. Still wanted, I think, a more compassionate with mental illness. And I want to show you what he had to say. This is my last slide. If we pull this up, page down. So Dr. Still would give an annual address. Is that being shared? I hope it is.
Not yet.
Oops. See, I'm really bad about this. Close that down. Got to go back to sharing. Okay, now we're back to sharing. There it is. Okay, share. What Dr. Still had to say at the end of his life. So he had lived, a pretty full life. Oops. Okay. So are we there?
Right? Yep.
We
can see it.
So he would give an annual address about something. And his last address, he dies, it was December of 1917. So about a week before he suffered a heart attack and died, he was writing his annual address for the students. And what he said was the best thing that they had done is move osteopathy into the treatment of mental illness. And working with Arthur Hildreth, who had pioneered this with the boys, his own kids, that we really have moved somewhere. He goes, I am so proud of where we've gotten with this profession. And so I do think that it's nice to kind of highlight that even in Dr. Still's trying to always push medicine further, that at his time, this was really an extreme movement, and he was so pleased with it and thought it was so important. So I do kind of, like said, like to kind of share that as we're coming up on the anniversary of his passing and what we're doing with mental illness.
Well, Jason, I have one more question for you before we go to any that are in the chat. So I just remind anybody who's listening right now, if you have any questions for Jason regarding AT Still and mental health, please type them in the chat now. And while you're doing that, my question is this. We've talked about AT Still, and we've talked about how he addressed mental health in a more holistic fashion than was being done during that time. What do you think he would recommend to us today? We started off kind of with a casual conversation about COVID and what we're seeing with COVID at the very beginning of this lecture. I will tell you, as a primary care physician, what I'm seeing more than COVID in my clinic right now is mental health. Depression is becoming, I'm treating that more than I am treating COVID at the moment. And we're treating a lot of COVID. What do you think AT Still would recommend us to treat this rising mental health crisis that we're experiencing during the pandemic.
What we need to help transfer to our patients and clients is optimism. See, that's the thing that kept Dr. Still going all those years. What I'm saying is he too suffered. And I think as we remind people that, I mean, they're here and now, and what are they, what are they doing, to make things better? Change your thinking. If you're focused on yourself and your own loss, it's hard to get out of that rut. But what Dr. Still would say is change your thing. If you're looking at optimism, what can you do? We know what you can't do, but what can you do to move things better? And even if it's a small thing, even if it's an email to some other person, just the act of doing something, of supporting another person, of being optimistic, that has a huge healing effect. What we know now is our lymphatic system basically is turned on by our thoughts of things are going to be better. But it is true. If we have thoughts things aren't getting better, it shuts down the immunities, it shuts down our healing ability, and it basically brings things down. And so I think, as Dr. Stoll says, and one of the best ways to build your optimism is get outside, look at the sky, watch a sunset, feel the air on your face, get into nature, and that in itself will help to heal you. You start to realize what is important in life. So I do think that nature and reminding people about doing good things, doing something optimistic, will have a healing effect for you. I hope that's helpful. But I do know that's something that when he had a patient who was suffering and dying, the first thing he said is, "Are you quitting? Because if you've given up, I don't know. But if you're fighting, if you're sticking with it, you're going to get better." And they did. And we find with COVID cases, Cuomo was one, he gave this whole talk. He goes, "You know what? I was ready to give up. But what I realized was I had to fight. I had to believe I was going to get better." And we find in the worst cases of people that should have never survived this, they were the fighters who said, "I'm not giving up. I'm sticking with it. I've got things I want to see my grandchildren. I've got things I haven't finished yet on this journey." And that optimism has a huge power on your immunity system. I mean, it's not magic. We're now understanding what is happening through your nervous system in the healing process. It's not magic. It's not, voodoo or hocus pocus, or it's not, wish therapy. It's real. That spirit and mind interaction in the body, it rules it. And that's what Dr. Still said.
Jason, I really appreciate it. I don't see any questions in our chat here, but I think you've ended it on really great notes. I don't think there's anybody alive that knows the mind of Dr. Still as well as you. So if anybody's going to be able to teach us what he would want us to know at this point, it's going to be you. But I love your comment, transfer optimism to our patients. I think that that's a great take home that we can take and that we can use and we can apply it. The teachings I got from AT Still University taught me a lot about mental health. I feel like I was very well prepared for it. I treat a lot of mental health disorders that maybe other physicians feel like they need to send to a psychiatrist. I wish I had that option, but we don't have that many psychiatrists here, and so I've had to learn to do more advanced treatments and treat more difficult cases. And I think that advice of transferring optimism is just a wonderful piece of advice. I know how to prescribe the drugs. I can tell patients about the side effects, but approaching someone from an environment and a nurture scenario doesn't have the side effects that those medications have. And I think if we were able to apply both and then transfer that optimism, I think we'd all, be better physicians. So thank you again, Jason. We appreciate your time tonight, giving us this insight about how things once were, and hope that we can apply them to our practices today.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. You're amazing too.
Thank you, everybody, for attending this lecture. If you do have questions or want to get a hold of Jason or myself, you're welcome to email Mayapps. They will forward them to both of us, and we can respond to any of your questions. If you're listening to this recorded, feel free to contact them as well, and we will be happy to respond back. So thanks again, and everybody have a wonderful night.